first question I want to ask you is the most simplest question I'll probably ask, and that is where you're from, where you're coming from.
I mean, where I'm from physically is right here in Baton Rouge. I will be 40 years old in August. I've lived here my entire life. I've traveled many places, but this has always been my home. This has always been my residence. Where I'm coming from a kind of spiritual or metaphysical sense, is a place of, I guess, constant evolution. I'm definitely not the person I was 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. You know what I mean? So I'm coming from Baton Rouge slash state of ongoing evolution.
You're the first person to answer the where you're from question in a very multi-layer way, because most people I've interviewed been like, I'm from London, I'm from Paris, I'm from Port Allen. And you're like, I'm from here geographically speaking, and I'm from here metaphysically speaking.
Yeah.
But I also want to explore both of those different places. So I want to explore the geography, meaning you're living here in Baton Rouge. What was it like growing up in Baton Rouge?
I grew up in North Baton Rouge. I grew up in a predominantly environment. And I did not realize how Black of an environment I grew up in until I moved to other parts of town. And so what I mean by that is my upbringing was a Black neighborhood. It was a Black church. It was a Black summer camp. It was, Black family gatherings and Black friends of families. And so I grew up inundated in Blackness, particularly in North Baton Rouge. And so I think that one of the power, I went to Southern University, historically Black college, around the corner from where I grew up. And I think that one of the powers to that is that I did not, even though I always knew that racism existed. I always knew that injustice existed. I did not grow up feeling othered because I grew up amongst a community and tribe of people that looked like me. And so even though there were things that were apparent that, we were in a subjugated and oppressed world, like I didn't feel othered, I think, until I got into another part of town or other settings. And then I was like, oh, wow, this is what it means to coexist in a quote unquote multicultural Baton Rouge. I feel othered now. I did not feel othered in my upbringing.
I could feel the same way because my upbringing was mostly Black. I grew up in North Baton Rouge too, and I didn't go to school with people who were non-Black until I got to middle school. So I spent a great part of my formative years in an all-Black environment. And honestly, those feelings of racial injustice and oppression didn't come about until high school, college, when I started to interact with more diverse people who saw me differently than I saw myself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. For me, I went to Scotlandville Magnet High when it was still like an official magnet school. And even with that, like Scotlandville was about number-wise, when I was a student at Scotlandville Magnet High, it was about, I want to say, 47% Black, maybe 48% white, another 5% folks of varying ethnicities. But even with that, even though the school was diverse and multicultural, it still felt like a very Black school. You know what I mean? We had a Black principal. A lot of our teachers were Black. And I mean, just physically, the location of the school, the reason I even had white and Asian and Indian classmates is because the interstate system was built around the time in 1982 when the school became magnet as it is. And that was built, partially to be able to transport students into that school, into that magnet school, without a fear of having to, go through a neighborhood, right? And so, but the point I'm getting at is even in that moment of going to high school in the early 90s or what have you, in a culturally diverse school, like it still had a very overarching Black essence to it. And then I went from there to Southern University. So it was kind of like, it was a wow. I would say poetry slam, spoken word poetry was the thing that really put me in a situation where I was around like actual cultural diversity. And that came years after, even like getting out of high school and a few years after college. So yeah, I had a definitively Black upbringing and experience well into my young adulthood.
My first introduction to you as a person was through the arts, was you as my poetry spoken word mentor.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of want to explore that journey because I see based on what you're saying, your journey through being a Baton Rougean intersects with your journey with your art and with your writing. So tell me what it was like becoming this spoken word poetry slam artist that is now someone who's internationally known in many circles.
Yeah, so the story I often tell is that my story as a spoken word poet, as a performance artist, has its roots in hip hop. And what I mean by that is I'm the youngest of three children. My older brothers, all of my brothers were 5 years apart. So my oldest brother is 10 years older than me. My second older brother is 5 years older than me. So I grew up consumed in hip hop in the mid late 80s through the 90s and whatnot. And so a lot of my upbringing as a young Black man, or a lot of even my definition of masculinity as it relates to the arts, was connected through the genre of hip hop music. And so spoken word and poetry kind of became almost a natural transition because I grew up with an appreciation of words and language that, quite frankly, I learned by way of Black men. The people who I looked to were creatives, they were rappers, they were artists, right? And that was a completely different paradigm than what we're often told about Black masculinity and about creativity and about, even language. Like hip hop and MCing made the world a much fresher place than it was prior to that. Now, of course, there's a lot of issues and a lot of just reprehensible things about the genre and about the art form. But for me, I don't get to become a spoken word poet, a slam poet, ultimately a teaching artist, ultimately a contributing writer for a publication without those roots. And those, that thing actually also just kind of moved me around Baton Rouge. I remember very vividly being a young kid at Southern University, like battling people, like freestyle battling people. You know what I mean? And there's not that far of a bridge between that and me being a Kennedy Center Fellow like 20 years later. That bridge is not that disconnected at all. But yeah, the arts for me always allowed me to vision and escape even outside of the trappings of Baton Rouge. And what I mean by that is, like, as long as I can, push to write as dope as I could, or push to perform as dope as I could, then I can see outside the confines of a very narrow cultural space. And so I don't know if that necessarily answered that question, but that's kind of what I could offer.
I think it more than answers the question, because for me, I'm seeing that you had this journey that started because you had the passion for hip hop, which led to a passion for words, which led to a passion for spoken word and poetry, which allowed for you to go different places and see different spaces. And wow, that rhymed. Wow, hey.
Yeah, look at you.
Yeah, and it also allowed for you to kind of use your art as a vehicle to being a part of the community and giving back to the community.
Yeah.
And so, we can spend all day talking about every poetry slam, open mic that you've gone to, but I'm gonna fast forward it a little bit to 2010, because that's when I met you, Zero, and Desiree, and that's when I started kind of being a part of poetry and spoken word. So tell me about kind of where you were at in 2010 when I first met you as a teaching artist, and what your work looked like at that time.
So in 2010, I was still relatively green as a teaching artist. As a performing poet, I had like 10 years in at that point. So I started in 1999 performing poetry as a student at Southern University as a freshman in college at the famed campus poetry reading that was known as the Mocha Room. A few years after that, I started competing on a national level with teams in Baton Rouge. A few years after that, in 2005, Dr. Anna West relocated to her hometown of Baton Rouge to start what was called the Wordplay Teen Writing Project at Big Buddy. Fast forward a few years after that, or by 2012, Dr. West had gone to Harvard to pursue her master's degree. Myself and Zero Skidmore left the Big Buddy program and began forward arts programming. And so you came somewhere around that era that I just described. But I think where I was in 2010 was that I definitely wanted to be like a slam star. You know what I mean? And there were people around me, primarily like Zero Skidmore, who had already like been a national finalist on multiple levels. And, you know, I was connected with other people in the national community, and I wanted that. Like at that point, I wanted a high level of national recognition as a competitive performance poet. And so like I think that what you came into and what other young people I was working with and mentoring at the time came into with regards to me was this hunger to be like the illest spoken word poet, the illest slam poet, which also has its roots in the way hip hop is structured. And what I mean by that is that, you know, those of us who grew up in 80s, 90s era hip hop, like there was always this thing of like braggadocio, there was always this thing of like wanting to be the dopest, the best, you know what I mean? This kind of, you know, competitive drive. And like Poetry Slam like fed that precisely, you know what I mean? Because it's a competitive art form or what have you. And so at that point, I think that I was not 1,000%, you know, maybe I was slightly disingenuous with what I really wanted out of the art form of poetry, or maybe I just didn't really know. I think what I did know is that I wanted to have a name and I wanted to be recognized as one of the best in the country at what I did. What I will add to that is that a lot of the things that end up like humbling me or at least redirecting my focus were young people like yourself that I worked with that pretty much showed me that, look, you know, being your maximum can look like a multitude of ways. It may not look like winning slams. It may not look like national titles. It may just look like you helped play a part in a young person finding their voice. And so that was kind of where the paradigm shift kind of began for me. Ironically, that you would bring up that time period.
To be honest and transparent, you know, Forward Arts and Word Crew inspired 821's formation. You know, not to say that we mimicked or copied anything, but
Right.
the idea of giving people a voice and finding ways to make people use their voices for good and finding ways to kind of make world issues, world problems accessible to people was something that greatly inspired me when I was creating my own nonprofit. I was like, I want to do what Zero did. I want to do what Donney did. I want to do what Dez and all of them did. You know, I wanted to be that for a young person or for even an older person that was older than me.
Yeah, so the first thing we learned with spoken word, and it said a lot, and definitely in slam, is this idea of creating a democratic space. And so what you spoke to was that, and when I say democratic, I mean like small d, not like democratic.
Right, yeah.
This idea of creating a democratic space. From that, we can grow many things, right? You know, as you know, 2 years ago I began a conference, the Black Out Loud conference, right? Everything that in the first year I was putting together Black Out Loud, any and everything that I gained from being a performer, an organizer, a teaching artist, I had to put all of those things into the pot to create a successful conference, right? So everything that you gained as a youth participant in Word Crew, everything that you gained as a youth spoken word artist, the idea of creating democratic space, the idea of speaking truth to power, the idea of centering narrative, like those are applicable life lessons that go beyond a microphone, right? And so it makes absolute sense.
And that's exactly what I've been trying to do with 821 And I've been very fortunate to be able to do that, not just within my own community as a Black person, but within the Baton Rouge community, Louisiana community, and even global. And it's funny you mentioned Black Out Loud, because the question I wanted to ask you was a gargantuan question, because you have done a lot, especially in the last decade. I mean, you've gone from spoken word and poetry slam to being given a national, international platform to talk about social issues through being a contributing writer, as well as through hosting a nationally recognized conference. And honestly, it can be a bit time consuming to ask you to talk about every single thing you've done. But the best way I can ask the question about your journey in the decade of doing your community work is to just walk me through your journey of going from this hungry spoken word artist who was trying to have a national platform as an artist to someone who is an activist who is almost internationally recognized for being passionate about Baton Rouge and the Black community and the issues that we face as Black people.
That definitely is a walk, and I'm gonna see if I can try to be as concise as possible. And I think the 2010 is actually a good starting point to move from 2010 to 2020. So as I just mentioned, in 2010, I was just kind of like, how do I become one of the top slam poets in the country, right? And at this point, I'm competing with teams, and I'm going to rehearsals, and everything is slam and spoken word, and that's just kind of what it is, right? Again, I will say that my work as a teaching artist was the first thing that I think opened up my humanity in a different way. And what I'm getting at when I say that is that I learned to mentor young people whose identities were nothing like my own, right? And so when I talk about the opening up of humanity, like even something as, I don't want to say simple because it's not simple, but even something as ingrained as homophobia, for example, growing up in an all Black environment, growing up in hip hop culture or whatever, like homophobia was almost second nature, right? But there's a difference between Donney, who was overcoming his homophobia when some of his friends came out to him, versus Donney, who was completely unpacking his homophobia when vulnerable young people who were looking to me as a mentor were like, this is who I am, right? And me, I guess, again, the competitive drive of wanting to be the best mentor I could be, like, how could I be a valuable, effective mentor if I was shunning someone's personhood and humanity and identity just because it wasn't something that I was, all the way familiar with, right? So very early on in, I would say in my development as a teaching artist and as a mentor, I had to unpack and unlearn a lot of things. So unlearning is definitely key. Unlearning is almost as key as learning. I would say that toward the latter part of the 2010s, I had a moment that a lot of Black folks had, specifically around, the killing of Trayvon Martin and things of that nature. And as social networking morphed into social media, and as we started to see things come across our screens a lot more, it evoked and it awakened something I think that was lying dormant within me all along anyway. So let me pause, not really pause, but let me shift and say this. Very early on in my slam career, the idea was write the most universal poem possible. The code phrase behind that was write the most palatable to white audience poem possible. Because if you do that, you might get high scores, at least on a national level, right? When I first got into Poetry Slam, there was the African American open mic held at the national event. There was the LGBTQ open mic held at the national event. There was the Indigenous open mic held at the national event. You know why those events were held at the national event? Because still, within this quote unquote liberal bastion of spoken word, there was marginalization. So folks still needed like an additional space within a space that was supposed to be liberal and free. And so around the time of 2012, you know, when Trayvon Martin's situation, murder, became worldwide news, it also was a part of a transitional period for me artistically. So I'm kind of, you know, I was reaching a point where I'm like, yeah, I can try to suppress these black narratives or these black stories, but this is like literally brewing in me. So I don't give a damn about what a slam score might be or what ranking might be. I need to tell these deeper truths and these deeper stories. And whatever is compromised with that artistically is. It just so happened that as that was kind of my progression, a bunch of black poets were going through a very similar thing, a very similar metamorphosis of, you know, craft, of intent, and of purpose. And so I've kind of always been a person that wanted to do beyond just talking the talk. I also wanted to walk the walk. And so as we slide deeper into the 20 teens, right, the 13s and the 14s, and as more stories of, you know, police violence or racial vigilantism become, you know, come to play, I'm just kind of like, I need to put my voice out here more and really like tell these stories from my perspective. And I thought that it was an interesting perspective to kind of approach because it was one that came from not necessarily a place of ignorance, but definitely a place that allowed a lot to lie dormant. So, what does it look like now saying, I'm not going to allow this to lie dormant and really just kind of step into, you know, this voice. And then every moment or every momentum like this has pivotal breaking points. So for me, it was 2016 when everything that I was talking about became localized, right? So at that point, you know, when Alton Sterling was killed in Baton Rouge, that was much like the George Floyd moment, a tipping point, but it wasn't necessarily the whole story. The larger story was that police violence and systemic injustice and racism in Baton Rouge reached a fever pitch in a foreground. So when I'm out there with young people who I was mentoring via Word Crew at that point, and I'm having to help them safely navigate to a march, it is no longer theoretical. It is a real tangible thing. You know what I mean? So when I was writing about Michael Brown and when I was writing about Eric Garner or Sandra Bland or Tamir Rice or whomever, that was theoretical. When it hit the backyard, then it became something different, you know? And so I think I kind of started to walk a lot more fervently into this kind of role of activism. And it's nothing I necessarily gave myself, but you know, it's something that people, you know, people said. Like I'm gonna quote my guy Gary Chambers, who said, "I first learned that I was an activist in the newspaper when someone said activist Donney Rose," and I was like, "What?" Like I'm just talking my talk, you know what I mean? But anyway, so 2016 was definitely a very like pivotal, you know, turning point with regards to walking in this kind of personhood of advocacy. Uh, and then things just kind of started to come along with that. You know, that year I got awarded from the local theater company, New Venture, with a Humanitarian of the Year award. I was like, me? What? Why? You know what I mean? Then the following year, I was mired in a little controversy with a former Metro Council member, and you know where he was like talking stuff about the work that me and my colleagues were doing, and that he felt that there was, you know, that the mayor's office should not be investing much into teaching poetry to gangbangers, and like all of my youngins rode, like they all got to riding on him. Like, no, you're not about to talk about our people. You're not going to talk about Donnie. You're not going to talk about our mentors. We like these people helped transform our lives, right? And then that whole controversy spun into Business Report being like, hey, maybe you're a 40 under 40 person, you know what I mean? And they gave me that, right? And then that morphed into the following year where a woman by the name of Maida Owens, who works with the Louisiana Division of the Arts, reached out and was like, I think he would be a prime candidate for this fellowship the Kennedy Center does called Citizen Artist Fellow I was like, okay, fine, shoot your shot. You know what I mean? And she was like, I'm going to submit your name. And then months later, I get an email and they're like, hey, congrats, you're one of 5 artists in the country this year to be a Citizen Artist Fellow. And so all these things just kind of morphed from me growing more comfortable walking into my personhood of advocacy. And that comfort has taken a while, and it still is taking a while to process, because when you step out on a ledge, like assuming any degree of cultural leadership, there's criticism that comes along with that. There's feelings of imposter syndrome that come along with that. It's just a lot, right? Um, and so my main focus these days is to try as diligently as possible to not mislead anyone, including myself, first and foremost.
I feel like you did a really good job answering that question and breaking down your journey because, I mean, I wasn't keeping time, but I felt like I saw each year pass by and each year flow by. I've very much intimately watched the journey and the evolution. I've seen the Facebook posts, I've seen the speeches, I've seen the awards, and it's great to see it because I'm like, that's my mentor. That's the person who, you know, who helped me find my voice. And now he's using his voice, and it's just great and it's beautiful. I know that a lot of the work that you're doing now is centered around Blackness. It's you, and you just said that you transitioned from trying to be, you know, universal and in a sense palatable to non-Black audiences to being unapologetically Black. And you also created Black Out Loud, which is, I think, one of the dopest conferences that I have been able to witness and be able to see evolve and grow. Unfortunately, unfortunately, I don't know if the physical Black Out Loud conference will be taking place in 2020. But I do know that, you know, you've done it in 2018 and in 2019. Right. So what is the conference like, and what have been some of the accomplishments that you've been able to achieve, not only through the conference, but through this Black Out Loud initiative that you've been doing that is, you know, spawned so much?
Yeah, so let me start with the origin. So the origin of the Black Out Loud conference actually came by way of writing that I was doing in 2017. So when I really just kind of started using my Facebook as a weapon, and I don't necessarily mean weapon in a bad way, but really like using it from a standpoint of, let me not just post some random arbitrary stuff. Let me like try to like really hone in on what I want to say and craft messaging. In 2017, in the month of February, I was doing shout outs to Everyday Blackness. And it was just like every day I was like posting a different shout out, like shout out to the Black cafeteria woman, or shout out to Black folks struggling with mental health. I wanted to re-envision what Black History Month looked like for me, because usually when people got into Black History Month, it was always like, you know, remember Dr. King, remember George Washington Carver, remember, you know, Rosa Parks, and all these people, all of these dignitaries of Black American life are important, and it's valuable for us to know, you know, who they are. But in the era of state-sanctioned violence in particular, what I learned and what really like kind of was sticking with me is that everyday Black people were becoming martyrs. It wasn't even nothing necessarily special that was going on. People were like walking into martyrdom just by living. And so for me, in 2017, I was like, what does it look like to honor who we are just as everyday people? So I put a bunch of these posts, and they were spreading wildly on Facebook. Like I would drop one a day and they'd be shared 40, 50, 70 times or whatever, multiple interactions. So after that, I was like, hey, y'all, if I were to put this in a book, would you all be interested? And folks were like, sure. So I put these things in a book, and I named the book Black Out Loud, which is a book of prose. So then, you know, I asked myself, if I was to take the context of this idea of Black Out Loud, of being, you know, vocal and being unapologetic and centering visibility, if I was to morph that into a physical thing, what would it look like? Maybe a conference, right? So then I thought about every slam that I ever maybe organized or every open mic, and for a very long time I was a promoter of nightlife events, and I was also a teaching artist. So like I mentioned before, I meshed all of these varying soft skills into this one collective idea of a conference. So the first year in 2018 when it happened, I just I had a hope and a wish, and I was like, let me see if I can do this. The initial plan was for Black Out Loud to take place in February of 2018, but I didn't get my planning, together. And so I was like, maybe August. There's a part, of August that's known as Black August, the first part of the month or whatever. My birthday is in August, right? And I was like, what if I centered this conference weekend around my birthday, and I accepted the vanity that may have come with that. But what if my gift to myself was a gift to the community, and trying to figure out how to put together just a really, really dope conference. And so I put my intentions out into the world, and people showed up. Well before the conference began, people showed up as volunteers, people showed up as sponsors, people showed up as donors. I remember that, my homie Van Lathan, who I've known for many, many, many years, had this big viral moment with Kanye West where he checked him on TMZ. And right around that time, I was looking for a keynote speaker for Black Out Loud. And I reached out to Van. I'm like, yo, uh, you think you might be down to come down to keynote? He's like, yeah, send me a plane ticket. And that's what it was. And so he came down and keynoted the first Black Out Loud conference, fresh off a huge watershed moment, right? Like he already was kind of being known as someone on TMZ, but that Kanye moment thrusted him into a whole nother like plateau. And he came down on the strength. And what that reinforced to me was the value of kind of moving as a person with integrity, the value of community. He came down to his native Baton Rouge on the strength of me. He was like, I know you've been solid, you've been about the work that you're doing. I'm going to come and do the solid, even in the most elevated platform of my career, talking about him. And so that first year went off lovely. I could not have asked almost for anything else. And then the second year was great, but I was battling like a great deal of heartbreak because the first year, my first cousin, Keisha Peaches Caldwell, was one of my sponsors. Um, she was also like my initial mentor into the world of spoken word and teaching artistry. So everything that I eventually would become to do, I saw my cousin Peaches do it first. She sponsored Black Out Loud in 2018 in August. By October 2018, she had died. It's a wild story where she was experiencing just a lot of pulmonary issues, and she went to a trip to Africa with her friends, and it was like her second time going to Africa or whatever, and she passed away in the motherland. Um, and it was a devastating loss for me because again, like everything that I would grow up to be as far as a teaching artist and organizer and mentor, I actually saw my first cousin do that before me. So she laid a blueprint. So going into the second year of the Black Out Loud conference, like that was looming. Like her death was looming in the background. That fall was also, it was just a difficult year because at that point, Forward Arts was starting to fold. It was dissolving. My cousin had passed. I had received another, bad health diagnosis on top of one I already had. And so there was just a lot of just gray area, you know what I mean, moving into 2019. But with the hope, with the help of the spirits and the ancestors and whatnot, I was able to power through and make the 2019 conference happen as well. And it was really great. We had an amazing artist named Moo Fresh, who's like one of the dopest performers around, who I became aware of when I went to the Kennedy Center. We brought Moo Fresh down for Black Out Loud 2019, and we had a really good conference around criminal justice reform and mental health awareness and financial empowerment. The first year themes were arts, activism, and media. So we switched up, things thematically. What I will say, for me, what I think that has powered Black Out Loud as an idea is not necessarily the annual conference so much as the subsequent events around it. And so, between conference years, we did a seminar called The Color of Currency, which was all around Black financial beyond literacy, but just kind of empowerment and advocacy. We did an open mic and mental health expo. We did dialogues. We were doing like a multitude of things that led into a conference. And I think, and the reason why I say that powered Black Out Loud, because it's been able to sustain it even now in this period where we can't physically come together. So when I do events on Zoom or when I do events on Instagram Live, what I'm borrowing from is the subsequent stuff that was not the conference, right? And so we've been able to do things that have kept the momentum going because we had practice in doing things that were not just a big annual conference. So that's been really cool to be able to do. But Black Out Loud again it came from a place of, and I'll try to like summarize it here. It came from a place of focusing on Blackness as a rich cultural, just the richness and the depth of Black culture. So even if I talk about the idea of not having to quote unquote write the universal poem anymore, writing the Black poem is the universal poem, right? Writing about Blackness in the fullness of its context is universal. You know what I mean? That's when we're thinking beyond American Black. That's when we're thinking about the diaspora. That's when we're thinking about all the culture that was brought over and dropped off in various parts of the world. That's when we're thinking about all of our joy, our anxiety, our fear, our innovation. That is the universal culturally depth narrative. You know what I mean? You don't really need much outside of that, right? And so that's not to say that I never will ever write about things or never will, pivot toward things that are non-Black anymore. But it is to say that, our Blackness and our actualizing our Blackness really is enough. You know what I mean? And there's still so much more to unpack and uncover and unlayer and disrobe and dismantle and unlearn and learn. You know what I mean? Like we can spend the rest of our lives really deeply diving into Blackness in all of its iterations and still maybe not come up with every answer. So, yeah.
It's very moving to know that, everything in your life has almost been very synchronized but organic as well, because everything has been influenced by the thing that follows it, and everything that you've done to help you grow has also helped other people grow with you as well. But I have a couple more questions I wanted to ask you, and I don't believe in false positivity and this idea of pretending that things are okay and just being happy, incessantly spilling rainbows all the time. That being said, I do feel as though the question I wanted to ask, which was about challenges that you faced, you kind of interwove that into your previous responses, and I don't want to be redundant, but I do want to know, based on the fact that you've had a lot happen in your life as a professional, as an artist, and as an activist, what are some of your greatest accomplishments, if you can't name just one thing that you would consider to be your greatest accomplishment?
I think one of my greatest accomplishments was almost reinventing a new, I don't want to say a new life for myself, but there was a point where I was concerned about my artistry like going astray. And my wife could speak to this like, really well too. So in 2013, I was a nightlife event organizer, and I stopped doing nightlife events in 2013. And I always kind of straddled the fence between artist and promoter, artist and organizer. And around in 2013, I was like, I'm going to put this down and I'm going to kind of refocus my energies into like really just being an independent creative, not necessarily creating platforms for other people, creating platforms for myself. And there's an article from Gig Magazine in 2013 when it was like he's retiring from this kind of nightlife or whatever and stepping into this second act of his individual creative self, right? And so a great accomplishment, one of my greatest accomplishments was to be able to successfully pull that off. So everything that I have accomplished that has made me a quote unquote household name has really happened within the last 7 years. You know what I mean? And it's not that I was nobody before then. It's not that I was not known in my particular community, but everything that has kind of pushed me into a slightly larger stratosphere has taken place over the last 7, 8 years when I consciously told myself, focus on you. Focus on what you can be as a creative, as a teacher, as an organizer. Put Donney at the forefront as opposed to trying to mask who Donney is behind other things that Donney is also producing. You know, I promoted events under Soul by Demand. That was my nightlife entertainment event company. That was primarily, I mean, we primarily did artistic based stuff, right? We promoted like spoken word and live music events and stuff like that. But for a very long time, I let that identity be at the foreground, because I'm like, this is me being of service to my community and like promoting and providing cultural experiences or what have you. Very similar to like what you're doing, you know, what you do at 821. The paradigm shift was, what happens if I drop the brand, the shield that may be hiding me in the background and move me to the foreground? You know what I mean? So everything that has come from that, every accomplishment has been that transition. And really what that is it has been a disrobing and unlayering of insecurity. It has been me being able to say who I am as a creative, as an artist, as a teacher can be enough to stand alone without necessarily having to have some sort of shield or have some sort of brand or have some sort of logo in front of me. So I think that in many ways my greatest accomplishment has been being able to comfortably step into myself and let that, you know, take center. You know what I mean? And in doing so, it's also allowed me to center a lot of other people. You know what I mean? Because I think that it's afforded me a great deal of authenticity, and people have felt like I can really like gravitate to this person. This person is not a business or a brand or whatever. This is a person, right? Um, and so, you know, again, like I credit a lot of that evolution to working with young folks and mentoring and stuff like that, and just kind of tapping more into my own humanity as I was, you know, assisting young folks evolve into their own. And so, yeah, you know, I know that's not a specific answer, but yeah, my greatest accomplishments or accomplishment has been the ability to foreground me and take everything that comes with that. You know what I mean? Like I'm still learning a lot about myself. Stumbling, faltering, doing things wrong, and not being afraid to fail publicly.
What are some things that you'd like to accomplish that you haven't had a chance to accomplish yet?
My biggest bucket list dream, if I could be anything, I would be a MacArthur Genius. So the MacArthur Genius Fellowship is something that takes place like every year, and they award maybe 20 to 30 people, something like that, with this fellowship. So some people who have gotten this in the past have been Nicole Hannah-Jones, the founder of the 1619 Project, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Reverend Dr. William Barber, a lot of noteworthy people. Now, for one, the reason why I want to be a MacArthur genius is because, well, not the only reason, but the primary reason, it is a extremely well-paid type of fellowship. And basically, it awards people to get this, this very healthy amount of money annually to just live their lives and do the things that they are driven by. So there really are no strings attached. Over the course of 5 years, MacArthur geniuses get $625,000, which amounts to $125,000 a year to basically just live their lives as who they are. And the fellows are anyone from, and not fellows, that's incorrect, but whatever, for the sake of argument, I call them fellows. That's artists, that's writers, that's activists, that's journalists, that's scientists. It's a whole wide range of people who have been gifted this. You know what I mean? So that's my big, super far-reaching thing. And you can't be nominated for it. Like you do things and you get on the radar, and then people find out about you, and then the next thing you know, you're that. But also, I'm conflicted about that. And the reason why I'm conflicted about that is that even with my fellowship with the Kennedy Center and other things that I've accomplished, I have now thought, I think a lot more critically about validations via white institutions. And what does it mean to be able to have this label of this person is this, and this person was awarded this, and this person has this, and where it comes from. And we're in a time of reckoning where everything is being questioned. Institutions are being questioned, where things come from. People are following the money trail more now than they ever did, maybe ever, right? And so one of the first things that happened, in the post George Floyd killing era, when every entity in business became super Black Lives Matter, one of the first things I did was check on every entity that had ever given me anything, just to see where they were standing. You know what I mean? And so I went to like the Kennedy Center Instagram page, for example, and I learned that the Kennedy Center for 9 nights had like black lights around their building to symbolize the almost 9 last minutes of George Floyd's life. And they really their messaging was really legit, because for the past 2 years, I've been out here telling people, yeah, I'm a Kennedy Center Citizen Arts Fellow, right? And so saying that to say, even though I may want to be a MacArthur genius or whatever, I've been thinking a lot more just about what does it mean to be validated by primarily white institutions? What is the compromise? What is the sacrifice to my identity if I'm like, yeah, this entity told me that I was this? You know what I mean? Like, what does that really mean? And I hope to see a point where not only myself, but all Black folks feel just as accomplished and validated by Black-oriented things, where we can take our own honors and our own awards and our own fellowships and our own appreciations and say, look, this is of the height of value. We don't have to be validated by this other thing. Like, it's cool, but we don't have to be. And I think that for me, that is the difference between the ideology of a seat at the table versus just having your own damn table that people come to, So the short answer is, it'd be dope if I was a MacArthur genius, because I want to be able to live for 5 years with that type of revenue and just do whatever. But the longer answer is, I want a day where anything that I can accomplish is not predicated by its proximity to whiteness.
My last question, because we've talked about a lot, but I also know that sometimes you can't always express everything you want with the questions that you're given. So is there something that you want to express or share that you haven't had a chance to share over the course of this interview that you'd like to share now?
I think my main thing is, kind of considering where we are in this period of pandemic and the fact that it's still a very prevalent thing. I want to share with folks to be careful, you know, to move with intent, to move about with intent, and to be mindful of their fellow humans. No matter how much people may be trying to politicize the moment that we're in, this is not really about politics. It's literally about life and death. It literally is about, I mean, all things are political, so there's definitely a political connotation. But in thinking about just how we navigate the world, the new normal that we're in, I really just want folks to take into consideration that everyone deserves an opportunity to see the other side of this. You know what I mean? Regardless of whatever, we all deserve an opportunity to see something beyond the moment that we're in. And so the only way we get there is by people, you know, tapping into humanity that may have been lost and just being like, look, maybe I don't need to be out here in the world breathing on everyone and extracting droplets everywhere. Maybe I can not do that. You know what I mean? Or maybe I can consider wearing a mask when I'm out in public, or maybe I can consider distancing. You know what I mean? Like I can look at being something beyond my selfish self. And so, not trying to do a PSA here, but I want folks to be able to see something beyond right now. A lot of people came into 2020 with a great deal of optimism, and globally, we have seen optimism shrink. And it began with the pandemic, and then it morphed into, just egregious state-sanctioned violence, and it keeps kind of, devolving into things that are worse and worse and worse. At the end of the day, for all of my critique or criticism about America or about the world at large or about systemic racism, I want things to be just and well, and I want people to be happy. You know what I mean? And I want people to have chances at living their best possible lives. And so right now, a very pressing thing that is interfering with people being able to live their best possible lives is folks not taking serious a very real serious thing. So wash your hands, wear a mask, practice distancing, whatever. Maybe those are bullet points, but give yourself an opportunity to see something beyond where we are. I'm not the oldest person in the world, but I've lived fairly long enough to know that you can get to the other side of things where there's a whole just different, better situation at hand. But you got to be able to move through the moment that you're in. And right now, we are in a collective moment where we all really have to chip in to allow each other to move to the next phase.
I want to thank you so much for sharing your story, being so open, being so real, being so unapologetically Black during a time in which Black people have to remind the world that we matter and Black lives matter. And I just also thank you for the inspiration that you've given me, both as a human being and also as my personal mentor through my journey as a writer, as a human being, as an activist, as an organizer, and just as somebody who's just trying to make sure that more people like I was as a teenager are able to find their voice and use their voice and feel like their voice matters.
Look, I'm proud of you. I'm exceptionally proud of you. You are doing the work, and you have been doing the work, and the work of the 821 Project is a credit to Baton Rouge. And if no one has told you that, it is. And I understand, from an organizing standpoint, that these things often feel like slow moving moments, but progress is more incremental than it is like a straight up dash. right? We're going to take
Hmm.
way more baby steps than we'll take giant leaps. But you're doing the work. And so keep those dialogues going, keep us critically thinking, because that's really how we're going to change like outcomes. Having people to think critically and really like unpack and dissect why do we human the way we human. And
Right.
I think that's the core work of 821, like really getting people to assess if we've been humaning this particular way for this long, why have we been humaning that way? And if there's a better way to human, why not we like explore that? So thank you and keep the work going.
Thank you so much. That means a lot.